The history of the Cold War is littered with intelligence-gathering organizations and surveillance programs designed to protect nations and maintain peace, order, and security both at home and abroad. In a Cold War context, what we often think about is the KGB and the CIA, but of course, every nation in some form or another has organizations tasked with this role for both domestic and international surveillance. Domestic surveillance during the Cold War was often conducted with the intent to maintain ideological purity and ensure there was no threat to the fundamental power of the state. While the KGB was certainly one of the leading organizations in this field, we would be remiss in not talking about one of the other such organizations which really did take surveillance to the next level. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to talk about the creation of the East German Staatssicherheitsdienst, the more than infamous Stasi. This is the Cold War. This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. CuriosityStream is the world's first streaming service addressing our lifelong quest to learn, explore, and understand, and was started by the founder of the Discovery Channel, John Hendricks. It has more than 3,000 documentaries on science, technology, nature, society, and most importantly, history, ancient, medieval, military, biographical, and beyond. Fans of the Cold War channel will surely enjoy CuriosityStream's Modern History playlist. As I'm sure you can imagine, we loved the 3-episode series called The Spying Game: Tales from the Cold War, which tied in so well with what we're currently researching. All of this is available worldwide on almost every platform you can imagine, including smart TVs Roku, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV. If you sign up between November 16th and January 3rd, you can take advantage of 25% off a yearly subscription. That's unlimited access for only $14.99 a year. So use the code TheColdWar when you sign up and get 25% off your yearly subscription. Go to curiositystream.com/thecoldwar or click on the link in the description to gain access to thousands of documentaries. Like so many of our episodes, we're going to start this one at the end of the Second World War. With the Soviet Union occupying the eastern portion of Germany, the Red Army and other Soviet structures found themselves responsible for the maintenance of order as well as for the establishment of communist control in the region. Of course, Moscow never had any intention of maintaining long-term direct rule of Eastern Germany and began the process of a slow transition of power to reliable German communists, who just happened to be pro-Soviet, of course, creating government agencies to allow for increased local governance. As part of this, 1947 saw the establishment of Kommissariat 5, K5, as the 5th department of the Volkspolizei, often just referred to as the Volpo. K5 was nominally the Criminal Investigation Department, but in practice were the political police, reporting directly to the Soviet occupation authorities. At the head of K5 was Wilhelm Zeisser, a former commander of the International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War and a German operative for Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. His deputy was another long-term German agent of the Soviet security services, Erich Mielke. K5 would arrest people who were deemed dangerous to the communist regime and would then turn them over to the Soviet authorities, where those people would be tried by a Soviet military tribunal. Now, at around the same time that K5 was being established, a second security organization was also set up, the Intelligence and Information Department, the ANI. A part of the Ministry of the Interior, it was tasked with gathering information regarding the public mood, as well as surveilling politically dangerous groups, particularly any non-Marxist organizations, which may have still been operating at the time. To facilitate this job, a network of informants was established to, as Mielke stated, know everything and report everything worth knowing. Now, despite this rather Orwellian statement, in the early days, the East German security agencies actually lacked both the resources and the manpower that would be necessary to actually surveil the entire population. As such, in 1948, the leader of the East German communists, Walter Ulbricht, traveled to Moscow to request from Stalin permission to expand K5. This request was heard by both Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, neither of which particularly trusted the leadership present in Eastern Germany. Beria was against the expansion of K5, fearing the loss of power and influence that would result to the MGB, which you'll all remember was the successor to the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. However, despite this loss of influence, it was recognized that in the face of the deepening tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, that a strong security apparatus in Eastern Germany would be necessary to maintain communist control, and Beria's objections were overruled by Stalin. In 1949, K5 was dissolved and a new organization was set up, the Main Directorate for Defense of the People's Economy. This organization, however, was only a transitory step, as things changed again the same year when the German Democratic Republic was formally established. In February of 1950, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the MFS, or Ministry for State Security, was established. It was also known as the State Security Service, the Staatssicherheitsdienst, or more commonly called simply the Stasi. With Seisser at the head and with a seat at the Politburo, what was to become the fearsome and notorious Stasi was born. Erich Mielke remained Seisser's deputy, assuming the role of State Secretary for State Security. In its early days, the MFS was a rather modest organization with only 2,700 employees. This, however, would change as the MFS grew, and there are some figures that indicate that the Stasi had as many as 30,000 informants by 1952. It's important to note, however, that the initial record-keeping at the MFS was sloppy, so the figures are certainly open to debate. The MFS itself was made up of several departments, including Department 6, responsible for the recruitment of informers, as well as fighting against such organized opposition groups as the churches. Other significant departments of note were Department 5, which was tasked with targeting underground resistance organizations, while Department 3 was responsible for the protection of economic installations in East Germany. There was even a separate section which conducted covert operations in West Germany. Now, the early efforts of the MFS were largely focused against organized opposition parties, which included branches of West German political parties as well as the churches. The goal was to eventually abolish all non-Marxist parties and organizations in East Germany, and methods employed to do this included infiltrating these groups with government agents, arresting their leadership, and then forcing them to participate in elections as part of the already ruling Socialist Unity Party, the SED. As a result, in the run-up to the 1950 parliamentary elections in East Germany, the leadership of the opposition CDU and LDP parties were largely arrested, as were any members of the Social Democratic Party who opposed its unification with the SED. The MFS was clearly at the forefront of the class struggle, and it took its job very seriously, not shying away from brutal tactics, including kidnapping and torture, as well as vaguely more benign methods of psychological warfare, including threats, blackmail, and the general disruption of people's private lives. These methods weren't restricted to just the GDR either, as they extended across the inner German border into West Germany, targeting anti-GDR activists. An article in Neues Deutschland from the 13th of July 1952 stated, quote, "Not a single agent of the warmongering imperialists is in safety, whether he is in West Berlin, Bonn, Paris, or even Washington," end quote. Neues Deutschland, for those who may not know, was the official newspaper of the ruling SED. So the MFS continued to expand. In 1952 alone, the number of employees grew by 2,822 people, and was also increasing its own legal ability to operate. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means that the SED was passing laws making the operations of the MFS, we just described, legal. For example, the law for the protection of people's property and other community property was adopted in October 1952. This provided the legal framework for the Stasi to expand and organize its informant network. It legalized spying and informing on your neighbors. 1952 also saw an organizational framework established on the best ways for employees to recruit informants, including who would be considered valuable, as well as the best tactics to actually recruit them. Interestingly, and perhaps initially counterintuitively, the best targets to be recruited were former wartime Wehrmacht officers, former Nazi activists, and members of the Hitler Youth, as well as criminals and homosexuals. Not only were these people considered to be easier to blackmail into service, but these communities were also considered by the Stasi as the most likely to be approached by anti-communist resistance groups. It was felt that having informants in their ranks was necessary to root out opposition early. So by 1953, the Stasi had a vast network of informants, had nearly annihilated organized resistance groups, and yet that year still saw a revolt against the government. Many people living in the East had become disillusioned in the SED regime and were aware of both poor living conditions and the absence of personal freedoms, especially when compared to their brethren across the border in West Germany. When the SED decided to increase work quotas but not adjust pay accordingly, hundreds of thousands of East Germans took to the streets in protest. And the MFS reaction? Well, it actually initially restrained itself. On orders from the top, Stasi officers were ordered not to use violence against the protesters and allowed the occupation of prisons, the release of political prisoners, as well as the occupation of government and party buildings. So why was this? Well, the East German government decided to allow Soviet troops to put down the uprising. Not only was the MFS totally unprepared for the scale of the protests, but there was a propaganda element to it as well. Having the Soviets be seen as the oppressors helped protect at least a veneer of legitimacy to the East German authorities. Of course, this restraint was only ever going to be temporary, and once the leash was removed, it took little time for the Stasi to swing into action. By the 18th of June, the very next day, the arrests began. In the 2 days after the revolt, the MFS and the Volpo arrested 1,744 people in East Berlin alone. By the 23rd of June, over 6,300 people had been arrested across East Germany. Of those people, almost 1,500 of them received long prison sentences. What followed was a series of repressions by the MFS so severe that the Minister of Justice himself, Max Fechner, voiced his displeasure at the persecution of workers and illegal arrests during an interview with Neues Deutschland. Fechner was a longtime communist activist and had been jailed twice by the Nazis for protesting persecutions, so keep that in mind when considering his criticism. Of course, his words resulted in him being personally arrested by Erich Mielke and then being convicted as an enemy of the party and the state, actions and consequences and all that. In the wake of the uprising, the SED leadership was extremely unhappy with the MFS. Not only was it not able to prevent the uprising, it wasn't even aware that something was going to happen. The result of this was backroom political maneuvering. Mielke accused Seisser, his superior officer, of conspiring against the party leadership and spreading the idea that the Soviet Union was going to abandon its support of the GDR. As a result of these accusations, Seisser was expelled from both the Politburo and the SED and forced to resign his position in the Stasi. The MFS was dissolved as an independent ministry and merged into the Ministry of the Interior. While Mielke remained in a deputy position, another former GRU operative, Ernst Wohlweber, became the State Secretary of State Security. One of the conclusions drawn in the wake of the uprising was that the informant network in the country was a major weakness. Wohlweber ordered the establishment of a larger network of higher quality informants across the country, especially in important economic and administrative sites. Mielke was put in charge of this project, and it was one at which he excelled. The Stasi, as a result of this network, began to grow into a formidable force in its struggle against dissenters, as well as in its anti-Western espionage operations. These programs were so successful, in fact, that the Stasi was returned to ministry status and the Central Committee under the leadership of Wohlweber in 1955. Wohlweber's rise to prominence, however, also led to his downfall. He clashed with Ulbricht over the direction state security should take. Ulbricht was insistent on the need to solidify internal security and on expanding the informant network, while Wohlweber wanted to focus on counterintelligence. At the same time, the Communist Party was undergoing an internal power struggle. An opposition faction to Ulbricht was forming around Karl Schirdewan, who favored a more open approach to governance in line with Khrushchev in the wake of the 1956 secret speech. Wohlweber sided with Schirdewan, which Mielke saw as an opportunity. Mielke accused Wohlweber of ideological subversion, largely based on Wohlweber's close relationship with several high-ranking members of the West German Social Democratic Party. The result of Mielke's accusations? Wohlweber was forced to resign in November of 1957. This time, however, Mielke moved up the totem pole and was appointed the Stasi minister on the same day Wohlweber resigned. While Wohlweber descended into relative obscurity, living the rest of his life working as a translator in East Berlin, Mielke set about restructuring the Stasi along the same operational lines as the KGB. Military ranks were created and instituted, and the foreign espionage networks were brought under the umbrella of the Stasi. Mielke would remain at the helm of the Stasi until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. During that time, one of the strongest and most feared intelligence services of the Cold War era emerged, holding East Germany and its citizens in its grasp. The organization was renowned for its unwavering ideological commitment, its efficiency and organization, and for its brutality. We will dedicate a future episode to Stasi tactics, methodology, and their impact on the lives of others. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have subverted the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.